Earth's reckoning for genocide, no more staying leashed. Velkoreth Dan would remember the stylus. Not the vote. The vote was 31-4 and it was finished before half the chamber had settled into their seats. He would remember the moment Urath Sorvin uncapped it, before Commander Emeritus Osai had finished her opening sentence, before the chamber archivist had even confirmed the session was live. The cap came off with a small, precise click that carried in the ambient quiet, and Urath Sorvin set it aside without looking up, the way a person sets aside something they have already decided they will not need again. Velkoreth marked it in his log. He marked everything. That was the function. The chamber of the convocation annex of Velorath ran 300 meters along its primary axis and sat at the neutral point of a deep space station whose construction had taken 40 years and the co-funded labor of 61 species. Its walls were inlaid with the ratification seals of 214 member powers, installed in the order they had joined, a deliberate architectural choice that meant the oldest seals sat near the floor, worn smooth by cycles of ambient air, and the newest sat near the vaulted ceiling where the light never quite reached them. The Kethsorvan seal occupied the third tier. It had been cleaned recently. Velkoreth had noticed that too. He noticed most things. He was paid to notice most things. The motion before the chamber was item 7 on the agenda. It had been filed 6 weeks prior under a legal clause ratified 14 years ago, sponsored by the hegemony, signed by the requisite co-signatories, and processed without procedural objection. The clause covered what the filing called pacification actions, the administrative closure of active settlements deemed to represent ongoing destabilization risk to member power interests. It had been used 11 times. It had never been contested, because the member powers whose interests it served held the co-signatory seats that would have been required to contest it. The item concerned 3 human settlements: Kepler 7, Hadrian's Rest, Voss Station. Combined population at last census, 2.1 million. The vote was 31-4. Velkoreth wrote, item 7 carried. Then he looked across the chamber at the human delegation and wrote, anomaly, no reaction, category unknown, monitor. Commander Emeritus Osai did not protest. She did not rise to file a secondary motion or request an emergency review or invoke the 3 cascade clauses that human legal teams had reportedly been drafting for months. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. She said, into the open record, in a voice pitched precisely to chamber ambient, not raised, not broken, 7 words. The record will reflect what was done. Then she left. The human delegation filed out behind her in a single column, unhurried, without looking at the hegemony's seats. No one slammed a door. No one paused. They walked the way people walk when they have already decided on a course of action, and the room they are leaving is no longer relevant to it. Velkoreth stared at his log entry. Anomaly, no reaction. He underlined it. The part that still keeps me up at night. It comes later. Stay close. 19 days passed. Velkoreth tracked them the way he tracked everything in accumulated data, in the gap between what should have happened and what did. On day 1, the human trading routes continued without interruption. On day 2, the human medical relief ships that had been stationed at the contested border zones Orvith adjacent, technically in a gray band of convocation jurisdiction, remained on station. They did not pull back. They did not expand. They held exactly where they were as if nothing had changed. On day 4, human council dues arrived, paid in full 3 days ahead of the quarterly deadline. Every surface indicator said, compliance. Every surface indicator said, accepted. Every surface indicator said, grief that had not yet found its shape. Velkoreth's function was to look beneath surface indicators. He ran his standard projection model on day 1 and set it aside. He ran it again on day 3 and set it aside again. On day 6, he ran it a third time, because that was what he did when the numbers matched too cleanly. When a model returned a result that felt like the projection had decided what it wanted to say before the data arrived. The model told him on all 3 runs that the human diplomatic silence was consistent with institutional shock and the typical 40 to 60-day processing window before a formal protest filing. Standard grief latency. Nothing outside variance. He sat with the model for a long time. Then he set it aside and pulled the raw data instead. Not the model's interpretation, the actual logged events. Day by day, timestamped, sourced. The human medical ships at the border zones had restocked their supply manifests on day 2. Not emergency restocked, scheduled maintenance cycle, logged in advance. The kind of thing done when a ship expects to be on station for some time longer. The council dues had been paid early, yes, but the payment confirmation had been queued before the vote, filed before the session closed, before Osai had finished her sentence. Velkoreth wrote in his personal log, Day 6, I am not watching grief. I am watching something that decided what it was going to do before the session began. Category still unknown. He underlined the category note 3 times. On day 6, because the raw data had made him look at things he had not thought to look at before, Velkoreth pulled the Human Fleet Register from the Hegemony's Strategic Intelligence Archive and opened it for the first time in his career. The archive was comprehensive. The Hegemony's intelligence apparatus was among the most thorough in the convocation, a fact that Urath Sorvin's delegation cited regularly, and not without justification. The Human Fleet Register ran to 11,000 entries, vessel classes, drive profiles, tactical formation patterns, estimated production capacity, projected expansion curves. The most recent entry was dated 18 years ago. Velkoreth read the date 3 times. He checked the archive's update log. He checked the source verification tag. He ran a secondary confirmation through the convocation's shared intelligence pool. 18 years. Earth had not filed a fleet update in 18 years, not with a formal withdrawal, not with a notice of restricted disclosure, not with anything. They had simply stopped submitting, quietly, the way you stop leaving footprints when you already know someone is reading the trail. He sat very still for a moment. Then he started cross-referencing the transit beacon logs. The transit beacons were mundane infrastructure, automated receivers positioned at the standard deep transit corridor intervals, logging drive signatures as ships passed through. They were not intelligence-gathering instruments. They were traffic management. Nobody looked at them the way Velkoreth was looking at them now, which was probably, he thought, the entire point. 17 beacons. At 17 separate beacons across the Hegemony-adjacent transit network, logged across the preceding 11 years, there were drive signatures that did not match any class in the registered human fleet. Not unknown signatures that would have flagged. They were close to registered classes, close enough that an automated system would return a probable match result and move on. But Velkoreth was not an automated system. He laid the signatures against the registered profiles and measured the gaps. The gaps were not random drift. They were development. Whatever those ships were, they were not the same ships as 18 years ago. They were not even a generation removed from them. They represented, as far as Velkoreth could calculate with the instruments available to him at 3:40 on the morning of day 7, something that had been built quietly, in the gap between the last filing and today, without once appearing in a record where anyone would think to check it. He filed the Tier 4 strategic alert at 3:40. Then he pulled the co-signatory list for Tier 4 escalation and found that the Hegemony held 2 of the 3 required seats. He sat with this for a long time, long enough that the station's ambient lighting completed a full cycle and came back to morning register. There was no mechanism to object to a co-signatory's structural position. The architecture did not require guards. It was the guard. He could not file a complaint about the co-signatory system to the co-signatory system. He could not escalate a blocked alert through the mechanism that was blocking the alert. He closed the escalation interface. He opened a personal channel to the Orovith Continuance's senior counsel seat, a man named Resjoreth who had processed convocation filings for 30 years, and whose institutional memory Velkoreth had once described, in a private note, as the closest thing to a neutral source in a non-neutral chamber. He flagged the message as personal, not official. He attached the Tier 4 advisory, the transit beacon data, and the fleet register gap analysis. He did not include a recommendation. He wrote, "I cannot file this through standard channels. I believe you should see it. I leave the rest to your judgment." He sent it at 4:12 on day 7. At 8:40, Resjoreth replied, I have read this 3 times. Is the beacon data from primary sources? Velkoreth replied, primary and verified. Resjoreth did not reply again until the following morning. When he did, his message was 4 sentences. The advisory would be accepted for review under Oravith Continuance Internal Protocol. The procedural escalation review would take 8 standard days. He could not move faster than the procedure allowed. He was beginning the clock now. Velkoreth wrote in his log, Day 9, 8 days. Whatever Earth is counting, it is not days. The 8-day clock was the longest thing Velkoreth had ever waded through. He worked because sitting still felt like a system in failure mode. He cross-referenced the beacon logs again, not because he expected new data, but because motion kept the projection model from running in his head without permission. The signatures held 17 beacons, 11 years of logged passes. Whatever was out there had been patient in the same way Earth had been patient about the fleet register, not hiding exactly, but not announcing. The difference between a secret and a thing that simply never came up in conversation. He filed his daily situational summary for the Hegemony's Strategic Oversight Desk as required. He wrote nothing about the beacons. He wrote nothing about the fleet register. He wrote, human diplomatic silence continues. No secondary filings. All treaty obligations met. Assessment. Standard post-vote processing period. Monitoring. He filed it and hated himself slightly for the word standard. On day 10, the full picture started arriving. It came in pieces. Not because anyone was releasing it, but because Velkoreth had set 12 secondary queries running across the Convocation's shared transit infrastructure, pulling historical data that nobody had thought to connect before because there had been no reason to connect it. The queries returned across 6 days, 1 or 2 results at a time, each one dropping into his review queue with the same flat notification tone that his inbox used for everything. He would hear that tone in his sleep for a long time after. The signatures at the 17 beacons were not a reserve fleet. He had allowed himself to believe for approximately 4 days that they might be a contingency, a hidden reserve, the kind of thing every major power kept somewhere outside the public register, ships held back from disclosure for obvious strategic reasons. If that was what it was concerning but not unprecedented. It was something with a category. What the historical cross-reference returned was not a category he had. The signatures at the beacons had been logged across 11 years, not clustered, distributed. A few per year, different corridors, no pattern that would draw automated attention. But the mass displacement readings told a story the individual entries had been too spread apart to show. They were not the same ships. The profiles evolved across the 11-year window. Drive efficiency, mass ratios, fold transit approach vectors. Each year's reading sat fractionally ahead of the last year's. The gap between the first logged signature and the most recent was not the gap between a reserve fleet and the registered fleet. It was the gap between what Earth had been building before the vote and what Earth had been building after it. No, that was wrong. Velkoreth sat with the numbers until he found the right way to read them. The development curve in the beacon log started before the filing, before the vote, before Urath Sorvin had drafted the clause. Earth had not begun preparing in response to the Convocation's action. Earth had been preparing. At some point he could not precisely locate, because it had understood that the Convocation's architecture permitted this kind of action, and had drawn its own conclusions about what that meant. He thought about the fleet register, last updated 18 years ago. He thought about footprints. He wrote in his personal log, I have been watching a shadow. The thing casting it has been standing behind me the entire time. Then he ran his projection model again. The model, for the first time in his career, returned a result on the first run that he trusted. That frightened him more than any of the other data. He marked day 14 in his log and wrote one line, category found. Category, they were never unprepared. On day 15, the Oravith Continuance's procedural review completed 3 days early. Resjoreth sent a formal notification through official channels, a filing acknowledgement, dry and procedural, the kind of document that would look like routine administrative correspondence if anyone in the hegemony's oversight desk happened to see it. Attached to it, flagged at the personal level, was a single message that read, "I have shown this to 2 other senior analysts. Neither of them slept last night. We are escalating. I want you to know your name will be on the founding document." Velkoreth read the message twice. He had not been thinking about his name. He had been thinking about day 19, because on day 6 he had written anomaly, no reaction, and by day 14 he understood that 19 days was not grief. It was a number someone had chosen. He did not know why 19. He did not know what 19 meant in a human strategic framework, but he had become, over the past 2 weeks, deeply attentive to the things Earth chose to do that looked like nothing until they became something else. He filed his daily summary to the oversight desk. He wrote, "Human diplomatic silence continues. Day 15, monitoring." He did not sleep. Day 19 arrived the way Velkoreth had been bracing for, not with any visible signal, just a single entry in the chamber's session log. Commander Emeritus Os had requested a brief, non-deliberative floor access at 11:40. Not a motion, not a filing request. Floor access. The kind used to deliver a physical document to the record. Velkoreth was at his analyst station, 12 minutes before the session opened. Os arrived alone. She walked to the central table, the long curved surface at the chamber's axis where physical filings were placed for archival intake, and set down a data chip. Small, matte black, the kind of medium used for formal record submissions that required a witnessed signature to enter the permanent archive. She did not place it in the intake tray. She set it on the table surface itself, which was not the procedure. She looked at the chamber archivist, not at Urath Sorvin. She said nothing. She left. The session log noted her floor access as concluded. The data chip sat on the table. The chamber archivist looked at it, then at Urath Sorvin's delegation, then back at the chip. He reached for it after a moment, handled it like something he was not certain about the temperature of, and placed it in the intake tray without opening it. Velkoreth wrote in his log, day 19. "She put something in the record, we don't know what yet. I don't think that's an accident." Urath Sorvin watched Os leave from his seat on the hegemony's delegation platform. His mandible plates had not moved. He did not reach for the stylus. On day 20, at 600 station time, a priority channel opened across the Convocation's communications infrastructure. It was not a sanctioned channel. It used the architecture of an emergency broadcast, the kind reserved for civilizational scale alerts, the kind that cut through every standard filter and arrived at every active receiver in the network simultaneously. Using it without convocation authorization was a violation of 7 separate communications protocols. It opened anyway. Velkoreth's receiver chimed with the alert tone he had never heard used in a non-drill context. He picked up the feed. The voice was calm, not the calm of someone suppressing something, the calm of someone who had decided, long before this moment, exactly what they were going to say and how they were going to say it. Female, unhurried, the kind of voice that pitched itself to be heard clearly without being raised, which in this context was somehow worse than if it had been raised. The Galactic Convocation ratified a filing on the deaths of 2.1 million human citizens as a legal pacification action. A pause, not a hesitation. A pause placed there deliberately, the way you let a sentence sit before you answer it. "We have reviewed the record. The record is complete." Another pause, shorter. "What follows is Earth's response to the record." The channel closed, 37 seconds start to finish. Velkoreth sat very still. He had 6 open queries running. He closed 4 of them. He pulled up the transit corridor monitoring feeds, every major deep passage corridor in the hegemony adjacent network, and set them to live refresh. He wrote in his log, day 20, 6:01, the 37 seconds are not the response. The 37 seconds are the filing number. The response hasn't happened yet. Then from the feed showing the Varenthi passage, the deep transit corridor that ran adjacent to the hegemony's primary military staging zone, a drive signature appeared. Then another, each one hitting the beacon's mass displacement sensor in the same 3-second interval, clean and spaced and deliberate, the way you space things when you plan them. 9. Then no more. 9 fleet groups sitting in the Varenthi Passage, not moving, not transmitting, not hailing the hegemony's border stations. Just there, the way a fact is just there once you have seen it. The first expeditionary fleet of the Keth-Sorvan hegemony, the largest standing military deployment in the Convocation's active membership, detected them at 6:12. Velkoreth watched the hegemony's automated alert system light up across his monitoring feeds. He watched 3 simultaneous scramble orders go out. He watched the first expeditionary fleet begin its response formation, its ships pulling into the standard confrontation array that every hegemony tactical officer trained on, the formation that had worked in every engagement the hegemony had run in 40 years. The 9 fleet groups in the Varenthi Passage did not respond to the formation. They did not hail back. They did not countermaneuver. They did not pull into their own confrontation array. They held position and waited, which was more frightening than any of the other options. Velkoreth looked at the drive signatures on his feed. He looked at the mass displacement readings. He looked at the beacon logs from 17 transit points across 11 years. He understood, at 6:13, that the first expeditionary fleet of the Keth-Sorvan hegemony, the assembled might of the most militarily capable non-human power in the Convocation, was looking at the development curve Velkoreth had traced across 11 years of quiet transit logs, and had not known what it was until this moment. He wrote in his log, 6:13, they built the model on data that was already 18 years old before the beacon started logging these signatures. Everything the hegemony thinks it knows about this engagement is a photograph of something that stopped existing before I was assigned to this post. He did not write anything else. He watched the feeds. At 6:22, the first expeditionary fleet's drive signatures went dark. Not one ship, not a formation element. Every vessel in the fleet, simultaneously, across the full spread of the confrontation array, went silent on the monitoring feeds. The mass displacement sensors stopped returning readings. The communication channels the fleet had been using for its scramble coordination went dead. The automated border station receivers that had been pinging the fleet's transponders for acknowledgement began returning a single flat tone that Velkoreth had never heard in an active engagement context. It was the tone the system used when there was nothing to find. He stared at the feeds. His projection model, running in the background, tried to generate a response scenario and returned an error. The error code was one he did not recognize. At 6:23, the hegemony's second fleet, staged in a different corridor, held in reserve precisely because the standard tactical doctrine called for a layered response, attempted its fold transit exit. The transit was supposed to take 4 seconds. At 6:23, the fold transit did not complete. Velkoreth wrote in his log, 6:23, second fleet held in fold, don't know how, category, no category. He sat with the feeds for a moment longer. Then he stood up and walked to the chamber's secondary observation window, the long panel that looked out over the station's exterior hull, the dark between stars, nothing to see, just a place to not be looking at data for a few seconds. His hands, he noticed, were steady. He was not sure what that said about him. He went back to his station and kept watching. Less than 12 minutes from the moment, the 9 groups appeared to the moment, both fleets went silent. Velkoreth assembled the operational picture from the feeds across the following hour, pulling fragments from the transit beacon reports, the border station receiver logs, the hegemony's own automated incident documentation, which was still running, still logging, because the bureaucratic infrastructure did not know how to stop simply because the military one had. The picture came together in the same quiet, piece-by-piece way all the other pictures had come together, and it was the same kind of picture, the kind that looked like arithmetic until you understood what the arithmetic meant. Civilian transport lanes, untouched throughout. 4 Keth-Sorvan passenger haulers had been in the corridor when the fleet groups materialized. All 4 had been queried, standard registry confirmation, nothing more, and cleared, released within the hour. The query logs were filed with the same precision as everything else, which meant someone had written the query protocol before the fleet transited in, which meant the decision to touch nothing civilian had been made before the operation began, which was a different kind of statement than sparing civilians because it was strategically convenient. There had been a heavy cruiser, one of the first expeditionary fleet's capital ships, that lost structural integrity at some point in the engagement. Vel'Korath did not have full data on how. The beacon logs showed the aftermath. The cruiser at reduced power, its emergency systems active, its crew complement broadcasting a distress signal on the standard frequency. 2 vessels from the 9 groups broke formation. They moved to the cruiser's position and held there, not attacking, not pursuing anything else. They pulled the crew, over 200 personnel, Keth Sorvon military, from a fleet that had just been neutralized from the vacuum. The medical intervention logs, filed through the standard humanitarian documentation channel, were in Vel'Korath's queue by 800. The crew had been treated and returned within the hour. The documentation listed every crew member by name. The documentation was filed before the operational report. Vel'Korath read that line 3 times. The rescue was the first document in the operational record for the day, before the strike order, before the fleet neutralization report. The rescue came first in the filing sequence because Earth had known the rescue would be needed before the first group transited in had planned for it, written the protocol, assigned the vessels, and had treated it as the first obligation of the operation, not an afterthought. He sat with that for a long time. Then the feeds showed the 9 groups moving. The orbital shipyard ring above Sorvath Prime held every active warship construction program the hegemony had running. Vel'Korath knew the ring because it was in every strategic briefing he had ever filed, the industrial backbone of the hegemony's military capacity, the reason the hegemony could sustain its fleet deployment levels across 3 decades without a production gap. Every platform in the ring represented years of accumulated investment, of technical expertise, of the kind of institutional knowledge that could not be rebuilt from scratch. The 9 groups moved through it in formation. Vel'Korath watched the platform status indicators on his feed drop, one by one, as the groups passed. Every active warship program, struck with a precision that was itself a message, the kind of message that could only be sent by someone who had mapped the ring in detail before they arrived, who knew the warship platforms from the maintenance platforms from the civilian supply depots, who had chosen what to hit and what to leave standing. The civilian habitat rings that ran alongside the industrial platforms, untouched. The worker transport infrastructure, untouched. Evacuation corridor broadcasts had gone out on open Keth Sorvon frequencies before the first platform was struck, in the correct language, in the civilian emergency register, giving specific transit routes. The broadcasts had been prepared in advance. The language files were clean and correctly formatted. Someone had proofread them. Vel'Korath wrote in his log. They wrote the evacuation instructions before they left. They knew which corridors were clear because they had been watching the ring long enough to know the shift schedules. This was not a response. This was a plan that was waiting for a reason. He stopped writing and looked at the chamber floor below his analyst station. Urath Sorvin had not moved in some time. The amber carapace was still. The delegation aides on either side had pulled back slightly, not dramatically, not noticeably to someone who hadn't been watching for 11 years. But Vel'Korath had been watching for 11 years, and he knew the geometry of the hegemony's delegation platform well enough to read it the way he read everything else. The aides had made themselves smaller. The mandible plates on Urath Sorvin's face were compressed inward, all the way inward, further than Vel'Korath had ever seen them go in a session, the involuntary narrowing that his aides had learned over years of proximity to read as the one tell he could not suppress. The stylus was on the table, uncapped, nothing written. Vel'Korath looked at it for a moment, the matte gray casing, the open cap set to one side, the nib exposed to the chamber's recycled air, and understood that at some point in the last hour, Urath Sorvin had stopped taking notes, had put the stylus down, had not picked it up again. He wrote in his log, he stopped writing. First time I've seen that in a session. The feeds kept running. Vel'Korath kept watching. By midday, the picture was complete enough to brief. If anyone had asked him to brief it, which no one did, because the people who would normally ask him to brief something like this were currently sitting in the convocation chamber doing nothing. He assembled it anyway, in his personal log, because assembling things was the only way he knew how to think. 3 facts. 3 things that did not combine into any strategic doctrine he had ever been taught to model. The first, the operation had taken less than 12 minutes. From the moment the 9 groups appeared to the moment both hegemony fleets were neutralized. Less than 12 minutes, which meant it had not been improvised, which meant the timing had been calculated, which meant the calculation had been done with accurate data about hegemony fleet response time, data that the hegemony itself considered classified, which meant someone had spent a very long time watching the hegemony's drills without the hegemony knowing it was being watched. The second, every civilian infrastructure element in the entire operation had been spared, not roughly spared, precisely spared, with documentation filed in real time, which was not the behavior of a military acting at capacity limit. It was the behavior of a military that had chosen a ceiling and enforced it, which was a different kind of statement, because it said that everything above the ceiling had been available and deliberately set aside. The third, the rescue. Over 200 Kethsorvan crew pulled from vacuum by the ships that had just neutralized their fleet, treated, named, returned, and filed first. No declaration, no demand, no terms transmitted after the operation. The 37-second channel had been everything Earth intended to say out loud. The rest had been said in the filing sequence. Velkorath wrote, they had not been leashed. They had been holding the leash, waiting to see if it would ever need to leave their hand. He looked at the line for a while. Then he wrote underneath it, the hegemony's model classified silence as incapacity. It has produced identical results until today. I do not know how you build a new model for a thing that was never what you thought it was. 3 days later, Velkorath received a formal session notification. Not a deliberative session, a record submission, a single agenda item, filed by the Terran Accord delegation, confirmed by the chamber archivist as compliant with physical record submission protocol. Floor access requested for Admiral Constance Vale Aduran, listed as attending solo. Velkorath read the agenda item 4 times. The submitted item was listed under the instrument designation, the Kepler Covenant. He did not know what the Kepler Covenant was. No one did. It had not been pre-circulated, which was not strictly required for a physical record submission, but was customary for anything that would have convocation-wide implications. The absence of pre-circulation was either an oversight or a choice. Given everything Velkorath had observed in the preceding 22 days, he did not think it was an oversight. He arrived at his analyst station an hour before the session opened. The chamber filled quietly, not in the usual way. The usual way was delegation by delegation, a gradual accumulation of bodies and administrative noise, aides shuffling files, the low ambient hum of a body preparing to conduct ordinary business. This was different. The delegations came in and sat down and did not talk among themselves. The chamber's ambient noise level was lower than Velkorath had ever heard it in a live session. People were watching the door. At the session's confirmed start time, Admiral Constance Vale Aduran walked in. Alone, no fleet escort, no honor guard, no aide. She carried the document herself, a single sealed physical file, the kind that required a witnessed signature to enter the permanent record. Her uniform was service dress. No decorations. Nothing on the jacket but the rank insignia and the unit crest. Velkorath had read enough about human military protocol to understand what the absence of decorations meant in a formal setting. It was what humans wore when the institution they were addressing had not held its obligations, and they had come to correct that, not to mark an occasion. She crossed the chamber floor without looking at any of the delegations. She set the file on the central table. She opened it herself without ceremony, without speaking, and let the chamber's own recording system register the document designation. The Kepler Covenant. The chamber archivist leaned forward and confirmed receipt. He began reading the first component into the record. Velkorath watched Urath Sorvin's hand move toward the stylus. He watched it stop. The archivist's voice carried across the chamber in the flat, uninflected register of official records reading, which made what he was saying sound almost routine until the words assembled themselves into meaning. No member power may file a pacification action for convocation ratification without independent third-party verification of all material claims. Any power ratifying without independent verification will have the action reclassified under the Council's Act of Aggression statute. The provision was retroactively applicable to all filings within the Council's institutional record. Retroactively, the word landed in the chamber the way a mass displacement event landed on a sensor feed, not loud, just suddenly present, with everything in the surrounding area reorganizing itself around it. Velkorath watched 3 delegation heads reach for their own archived filings at the same moment. He watched a 4th delegation aide lean down and say something quiet to their principal. He watched the principal go very still. The archivist paused, drew a measured breath, then began to read the second component. The second component was not a legal instrument. It was a list. The archivist's voice did not change inflection. It simply began to read names. Kepler 7 Settlement Registry, Dr. Sarah Chen, Engineering Coordinator, deceased 2.1 million cycle 400 standard. Husband James Chen deceased. Children Michael Chen age 7 deceased. Emma Chen age 4 deceased. The chamber went still in a way that made the earlier stillness look like movement. Dr. Amara Okonkwo, Geological Surveyor, deceased 2.1 million cycle 402. Spouse David Okonkwo deceased. Daughter Zainab Okonkwo age 11 deceased. Velkorath watched the chamber. Not Urath Sorvin yet, the wider chamber first. Watched the delegations recognize in real time what was happening. This was not a legal recitation. This was not procedural record-keeping. This was inventory. The hegemony had filed the death of 2.1 million humans under a legal clause that treated them as abstract pacification actions, a line item, a neutral administrative closure. Earth was filing them back as people. Dr. Robert Hassan, Medical Director, deceased 2.1 million cycle 356. Children Layla Hassan age 19 deceased. Omar Hassan age 16 deceased. Fatima Hassan age 12 deceased. The archivist did not pause between names, did not inflect sympathy or weight into his voice, simply continued in the same administrative register, which made the names themselves become the weight, each one a small precise blow, delivered in the language of convocation procedure, using the hegemony's own institutional voice to read back what the hegemony had filed as a closed matter. Velkorath looked at Urath Sorvin. His hand was still on the table, not on the stylus, not reaching for it, just resting there, the mandible plates compressed fully inward. The delegation aides had stopped even pretending to work. They were watching the archivist, watching Urath Sorvin, watching to see if anything in the chamber would break first. The names continued. Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka, Operations Chief, deceased 2.1 million cycle 419, family listed as no surviving dependents. Designation, primary advocate for Kepler 7 colony expansion proposal, rejected by Convocation Committee, 2.1 million minus 17 days. Velkorath felt something shift in the chamber's geometry. A delegation seat to the left, the Orovith continuance, had leaned forward slightly. Dr. Marcus Webb, Settlement Administrator, deceased 2.1 million cycle 358. Children Thomas Webb age 9 deceased. Grace Webb age 6 deceased. Wife Eleanor Webb deceased. Note: Eleanor Webb filed secondary petition for independent third-party verification of pacification rationale. Petition rejected by hegemony co-signatory override. 2.1 million minus 4 days. The archivist paused, only for breath, but in that pause Velkorath understood what Earth had done. It had not simply filed names. It had filed context, had matched each death to a decision made, a proposal rejected, a petition overridden, a voice unheard, had turned the names into evidence, had made the abstract administrative closure into a catalog of choices. Velkorath looked at Urath Sorvin's other hand, the one on the delegation table. The fingers were not moving. The archivist continued for 7 hours and 4 minutes. 7 hours. Every name from Kepler-7, then Hadrian's Rest, then Voss Station. Over 2,000 names read in the administrative register, each one anchored to a death time, a family structure, a last action taken or petition filed. Some names appeared with notation: primary contributor to Human Welfare Initiative, convocation cycle 2.1 million-34. Some with submitted technical proposal on radiation shielding, rejected as non-priority. Some with child age 3, no independent action in record. Children. The archivist read the children's names in the same flat voice he used for everyone else. Michael Chen, age 7, deceased. Zainab Okonkwo, age 11, deceased. Thomas Webb, age 9, deceased. And the names became unbearable in their ordinariness, their specificity, the fact that they had been written down somewhere in Earth's records and preserved and brought here and read into the convocation's permanent archive in the administrative register that made them official, undeniable, part of the institutional record. At the 3-hour mark, a delegation from the Southern Coalition requested a recess. The request was denied. The convocation's standing rules did not permit recess during the reading of a formal record component. The delegation was reminded of this. The reading continued. At the 5-hour mark, Urath Sorvin's hand moved, not to the stylus, to his mandible. The plates were compressed so far inward now that he was physically holding them closed. His hand was shaking. Velkoreth wrote in his log, "He's trying not to move. That's what the compression is. He is actively restraining himself from something, and it is taking everything he has." At the 6-hour mark, a formal objection motion was filed by the hegemony delegation, a request to interrupt the reading, citing chamber fatigue protocols and the adequacy of the first 2 hours of record data for institutional purposes. The chamber archivist confirmed receipt and noted that the objection was non-responsive to an ongoing formal record component, and therefore did not interrupt the reading, per standing rules. The hegemony delegation was reminded of this. The reading continued. Velkoreth watched Urath Sorvin's mandible plates begin to shake. At the 6-hour, 52-minute mark, the archivist read the final name: Dr. Catherine Voss, settlement founder, deceased 2.1 million cycle 401. Children. The archivist paused, which he had not done in 7 hours. Children, no surviving record. Spouse, no surviving record. Note: Catherine Voss submitted petition for convocation arbitration on procedural grounds, 2.1 million cycle, 404 minutes before her death was recorded. Petition was not processed due to filing error. Correct routing was implemented 2 hours post-mortem. Petition was subsequently rejected by co-signatory override as non-emergency priority. Record item flagged for clarity. Petition was received, reviewed, and deliberately rejected while outcome was already determined. The archivist set down the record. Reading complete. Second component of the Kepler Covenant entered into permanent archive. All data independently verified per convocation third-party standard. Respectfully submitted by the Terran Accord delegation. No further oral testimony requested. Then, into the vacuum of the chamber's silence. The chamber recognizes requests for secondary motions. Urath Sorvin stood, not rising from his seat, standing up, which was different, which was the formal signal for a major delegation statement, which meant whatever he was about to do was going to be on record in the archive, going to be permanent, going to be his name attached to the next action the hegemony took. Velkoreth's projection model, running in the background of his awareness, had already completed 3 different scenarios for what came next. All 3 ended with Urath Sorvin filing the objection motion that would begin the process of challenging the Kepler Covenant's retroactive application. All 3 had probabilities above 70%. Urath Sorvin opened his mandible, and then from across the chamber, the Orovith Continuance delegation stood, not their principal, all of them. All 12 members of the delegation rose from their seats simultaneously. Then the delegation from the Eastern Reach stood. Then, in a cascade that Velkoreth would later struggle to explain in his log, because the timing suggested coordination that should have been impossible with no prior communication, 17 Other delegations rose from their seats. 31 delegations standing. The chamber's procedural framework required a simple majority to overturn a co-signatory objection to a record component. 31 was more than a simple majority. 31 was a supermajority on a scale the convocation had not seen in the procedural record. They were not filing an objection. They were filing an abstention from objection. The chamber archivist noted it in the official record. 31 delegations abstained from secondary motion proceedings. Co-signatory objection process initiated requires all co-signatories to proceed. Hegemony co-signatory sole remaining party. Request acknowledged. Hegemony objection motion proceeding to record. Urathsorven's mandible was still open. His hand was on the delegation table, not moving, just resting there, the way a hand rests when the person it belongs to is no longer certain what it is for. The chamber archivist waited. The hegemony delegation waited. Velkorath watched from his analyst station and understood in that moment that Urathsorven had reached the thing his projection models had never modeled, because no one in the hegemony had ever needed to, the moment when the objection motion could still be filed, where the procedure still technically permitted it, where he could still choose to continue, but where that choice would now be solo, recorded against 31 standing delegations, and would look like what it was. Not an objection to a legal procedure, but a refusal to acknowledge what every other power in the chamber had just acknowledged as true. Velkorath wrote in his log he could file it. The procedure allows, he is choosing not to. Urathsorven lowered his mandible. He sat down. The objection motion was not filed. The Kepler Covenant entered into permanent law. The 31 delegations remained standing until the chamber archivist confirmed entry, then sat down in a single motion, like a door closing. Admiral Aduran stood. She crossed the chamber floor the same way she had crossed it before, unhurried, direct, without looking at the delegations. She retrieved the covenant from the central table. She held it for a moment, the way someone holds something that has just become heavier, and then she left the chamber without turning back. The session log noted her departure as 7:23 standard, 7 hours and 23 minutes after the archivist had begun to read. Velkorath sat at his analyst station for a long time after the chamber cleared, not working, not writing, just sitting. Around him, the station's ambient system cycled through their evening register. The lighting shifted to the longer wavelengths that human circadian cycles seemed to prefer, though there were no humans on this station to prefer them. The station was still rotating. The beacons were still logging. The convocation's institutional machinery was still running, was still filing documents, was still pretending that this day was the same as any other day, which was the only way it could continue. He opened his personal log. He scrolled back through the 19 days he had been writing in it, back through the stylus uncapped, back through the fleet register gap, back through the moment he had understood that Earth had been standing behind him the entire time. He found the line he had written on day 6. I have been watching a shadow. The thing casting it has been standing behind me the entire time. He read it, then he opened a new entry. Day 23. The filing is complete. The Kepler Covenant is law. The hegemony will survive this. We survive things. We adapt, integrate the new legal framework, adjust our strategic posture. The models are already running. By next quarter, the institutional language will have shifted to accommodate the new reality. It will be called learning. It will be called adaptation. But Urathsorven will not file the objection. I watched his hand reach for the procedure and stop. I watched him choose to sit down. Whatever the reason, pragmatism, institutional pressure, the weight of 31 standing delegations, or something else entirely, he made a choice. And that choice will not be forgotten by Earth. It will not be forgotten by anyone in this chamber. The leash is still in Earth's hand, and it will remain there because Urathsorven reached for the objection and chose not to complete it. That choice is now part of the record. That choice is what Earth filed. The names were the justification. The objection that was not filed, that is the real document. I do not know what comes next. The models do not know. We are waiting, all of us, to see if Earth will use the leash or simply leave it there, a permanent presence in the convocation's architecture. Either way, we will never be unknowing of the fact that it exists. And that is enough. He closed the log entry. On the chamber floor below, a maintenance worker passed through the session space, beginning the evening cleaning protocols. The central table was empty. The covenant had been filed in the archive, the data chip secured in the permanent record storage. But there on the delegation platform where Urath Sorvin had been sitting, the maintenance worker found something. A stylus, matte gray, uncapped, the nib exposed. The cap was lying separate on the floor beneath the table. The worker picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then placed it in the lost property bin with a cataloging tag, as protocol required. Velkoreth watched from his station window as the worker moved through the chamber, watched the maintenance cycle complete, watched the chamber lights shift to night register, watched the last delegation aide lock their station and leave. The stylus sat in the lost property bin. No one came back for it.